All right, good day, class. So we're going to try and finish today, the remaining theoretical approaches to doing political analysis and research. Hopefully, we can, but we're going to focus more on at least two more theoretical approaches, which is feminism and the gendered approaches, and Marxism. But before that, let me just briefly recapitulate what has been discussed so far. So far, we talked about at least four theoretical approaches to doing political analysis. And the first one is behavioralism. Of course, this goes without saying that behavioralism is very important and is very impactful when it comes to the development of political science itself. Um, Now, actually, our main takeaway from behavioralism is that it is a kind of theoretical approach to the discipline of political science which focuses on explaining political phenomenon which is actually observable. Okay, so the political phenomenon, meaning to say these are the political behaviors of political actors, are actually observable. And since they are observable, they could be explained theoretically. And so here you can see the focus of behavioralism to theories. Theories are actually very important for behavioralism and for political science in general. We learn from behavioralism that the theory is actually containing an explanatory mechanism that tries to provide the explanation between the relational mechanism between causes and effects, or between independent variable, or antecedents and outcomes. And these should be falsifiable, which means to say that they have to be capable of being tested against empirical data. So that's really very important when it comes to behavioralism. Then next is rational choice theory. We studied in rational choice theory that there are two basic assumptions of these rational choice scholars. And basically, they just got it from economics. They believe that human beings are actually rational, and at the same time, they pursue their self-interest rationally. And so, therefore, human beings, maybe individuals or groups, are actually motivated by incentives. And then we also talked about institutionalism, right? Institutionalism or neo-institutionalism is kind of theoretical approach to political science that focuses on organizations as being the rules of the game. And these organizations, being the rules of the game, or shall I say institutions, basically they regularize pattern of behavior. Okay? So these rules of the game regularize patterns of behavior. And these rules of the game are basically institutions. Then we also talked about constructivism, right? We said that the core distinctiveness of constructivism lies in its attention to role of interpretation in action. So the highlight of constructivism is basically interpretation. Because the idea here is that the constructivists argue that actors are always interpreting through social constructs. And thus, also the observers must learn to interpret social constructs to understand action. So this basically means to say that constructivists believe that everyone is basically interpreting his action, her own action, and the actions of everyone around him or her, including the researcher himself or herself. And some constructivists even think that since all human action passes through interpretation, and since scholars themselves are also interpreting through their own filters, we should not ever pretend that we can access the real world. This is actually the stark contrast between the constructivists and the behavioralists. The behavioralists, remember, they believe that there is actually an objective reality, and we can study this objective reality, and we can learn from it, and we can even explain what's happening. For constructivists, they will say, well, since everything is simply about interpretation, there is really nothing that we can learn. We just interpret, because the most that we can do, even as researchers, no matter how informed we are or insightful we are regarding a particular political phenomenon, we are still interpreting. Okay? And so social constructs is created by actors themselves. And since it is a relatively intangible kind of landscape that interacts profoundly with the nature and inclinations of the actors, constructivists have long debated whether their arguments even operate in the same realm as non-constructivist arguments. So basically, they are saying that, you know, uh, their ideas could never coincide with the non-constructivist approaches, because they're just so different that the non-constructivist approaches will not be able to appreciate constructivism, and vice versa. But this goes without saying that not all constructivists are like that. There are some constructivists who are actually willing to dialogue with other non-constructivists approaches. Now, when it comes to feminist and gendered approaches, okay, um, feminist approaches are both corrective and transformative. Corrective in the sense that they have sought to rectify the gendered blinkers and biases of mainstream political science. Well, that means that mainstream political science is actually biased according to the feminists. Biased in the sense that the analysis of mainstream political science is limited to the kind of politics which is predominantly men. Because most of the time, since we are focusing on what we call high politics, meaning to say these are the kind of political events that are happening, the focus of our attention, and most of the participants in this kind of politics are actually men. Not to mention that most political scientists are actually men. And so the kind of analysis is a bit incomplete and not holistic. So the feminist approach basically tries to tell us that in order for us to be more complete in our understanding of politics, we have to include the feminist side. And so in a way, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to move away from these biases. And of course, it's not only that it is corrective, meaning to say it does not just want to expose the gender biases in power relations, but also they want to change this. So it is transformative. They do not just simply want to correct the biases. They also want to transform the society so that there will be equality among everyone, including males and females. Well, most definitions of feminism basically share a common concern with women's unequal position in the society. Okay? And calling into question power relations between women and men traditionally defended as natural. Because since, time immemorial, I believe, the society has been predominantly patriarchal. And it seems that we just simply accepted this as a kind of common sense. And so, feminists will try to, do something about the unequal position in society. Remember that they're not just simply trying to correct the biases, but they're also trying to transform the society. But nevertheless, just like other approaches, there is a lot of diversity among the feminist approaches. There are many kinds: first wave feminism, second wave feminism, all these sorts. There are different authors, different versions of feminism. But at the core, they just simply want to move away from this gender stereotyping that basically beleaguer mainstream political science. And also, they want to transform the society into something better. Well, historically, most political scientists were men. And the spheres of public politics that they studied were likewise overwhelmingly men. And so, the feminists would try to move away from this kind of political situations in order to have a more holistic understanding of political phenomenon. Well, issues of women and gender were therefore usually ignored, with women relegated to the private sphere and what we call low politics, while men were associated with the public sphere and high politics, which is the central focus of mainstream political science inquiry. But for the feminists, even if most of the women are confined with low politics, there is still a lot that we can learn from there. Because they believe that actually this low politics, or shall we say the personal, is actually very much political. And when we talk about gender, gender can be understood as a constitutive element of social relations based upon perceived differences between women and men. And so, from an analytical perspective, gender can therefore be seen as useful category to examine and identify the socially constructed rather than the natural or the given. You see, gender is actually something that is also socially constructed. And so if you put this at the center of your analytical lens, you will gain understanding as to the patterns of meaning, identities, ideas, opinions that are basically influencing how men and women behave differently. And so they also could have different takes on what is political. And yes, we can actually examine and identify the socially constructed institutional roles, identities, and practices conceived of as masculine or feminine in particular contexts. So, I think one of the best points of feminism is that it provides a more holistic understanding of politics. Okay? Let me give you an example. Say, for instance, the Marxist perspective. Marx is a very good critique of capitalism and a very good critique of labor and the modes of production. But according to feminists, Marx basically fell short in his analysis because his analysis is not complete. He focuses more on those workers who are in factories working, toiling day and night, who are predominantly men. But the thing is, so Marx is actually fighting for their fair share of the profit or the surplus from the proletariats, or against the proletariats. Against the ruling class, I mean. But come to think of it, how can these workers who are men work if they don't have their wives, or if they don't have women which will take care of their household chores when they leave? Right? Is it really possible for you just working without being confident to leave your wife at home to take care of your children, to do the cooking, to do the laundry, so that when you go home you can rest because there's actually something to eat? Right? So, meaning to say, when it comes to fighting for the surpluses, it's not just simply the workers who should have their fair share. Even the housewives who are not actually working. And yet, these working men who are toiling day and night in factories cannot work without their wives. See, you get that point? So it's a more holistic understanding. And I think that's the best point of feminism. It provides us a more objective lens, a complete perspective. I will not say really complete, but a more complete understanding of what is truly happening. And of course, last but not the least, what I can say about feminism and gendered approaches is that political representation is actually the central concern of feminist politics and gender and politics research agenda. Because, as I've told you, they basically want to transform the society in order for everyone to have a better life. Now, okay, so that's about it when it comes to feminism. Now, what about Marxism? Um, when we discuss Marx, I will say a disclaimer first that we're just barely scratching the surface. And, even if we devote an entire year on just talking about Marx, we cannot exhaust the genius of this guy. Although personally, I don't agree that communism is actually an alternative to to democracy or to capitalism. But what I can say, it's a very good critique of capitalism. Because sometimes we just take the values of capitalism as a kind of common sense. We don't question them already. That's why bad things happen. And when we read Marx, we'll realize that, well, not everything is beautiful, right? Not everything is fairy tale in capitalism. As a matter of fact, half of it is actually horrendous. A lot of it will, if you really look at what's happening, the horror of, these things that are happening within capitalism will surface. And basically, that's what Marx was talking about. Well, Marx argued that capitalism was basically a mode of production. Okay? When we talk about mode of production, you see, Marx focuses on production. This is the reason why, he was called a materialist, because the focus of his social analysis is basically the idea that at the heart of all human civilization and all human activities and what have you is basically production. That's what gives us meaning, that's what gives us life, it's what sustains us, it's the reason why we can survive all throughout these years. It's basically we can produce. We produce food, we produce our clothing, we build houses, we produce apparels, we produce everything that we need, things that we consume every day. Okay? And so for Marx, that the center of what's happening in the society is actually the mode of production. And during the Industrial Revolution and even up to this day, the mode of production is actually capitalism. Okay? And when we talk about mode of production, it basically involves forces and relations of production. Forces of production is basically the technology, the strategies, the know-how of how to produce. While relations of production is basically the exploitative nature of the relationship between the ruling classes or the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the businessmen, and the workers or the proletariats. Okay? All right. So yeah, Marx argued that capitalism was a mode of production in which one class of people, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the elites, exploited another class of people, the proletariat or the working class. And these will even become starker, sharper as capitalism progresses until it leads to a revolution. Because Marx will say capitalism will progress. It will progress and progress and progress. But he also mentioned that within it is actually the seeds of its own destruction. Because time will come when this exploitation can no longer be tolerated by the working class. They will develop a kind of class consciousness and they will revolt against the system and they will overthrow the capitalists. And so Marx will say that it is inevitable, revolution is inevitable in capitalism. So yeah, I've been talking about the focus of Marx's social analysis, which is basically production. Okay? And the forces and relations of production, or what we can call the mode of production, determines the superstructure. So the modes of production determines the superstructure. What's the superstructure? It's made up of culture, norms, ideas, institutions, and even the state. So what does it mean? It means that, well, Marx believed in the primacy of the economic. And this means that the economic is the one influencing the social, the cultural, and the political. As a matter of fact, he's saying that everything happening in the society is actually influenced by the mode of production, by the economic. That's why we said that with Marx, we say that there's primacy of the economic. Even the state itself is actually at the mercy of these economic forces. Now, capitalism is the basis for globalization. You see, a lot of researchers in political science right now focuses on globalization. And it's really difficult to do political science research if you're not gonna take into consideration the global forces that influence even the domestic politics. And Marx will say that even globalization is actually a product of capitalism, which in essence means that this is the expansion of capitalist social relations beyond the national borders. Because what's really important for capitalism is basically the pursuit of higher profit. that never-ending pursuit of higher profit. And capitalists will basically do everything in their power to pursue profit. Marx believed that capitalism is the most dynamic of all the modes of production that are present in history. It is the most dynamic in comparison to all the previous modes, and it had the effect of incorporating all countries, localities, and regions into the world market. Because capitalists will basically, in their search for higher profit, will try to look for new markets, right? Because new markets imply that there will be higher profit. Okay? So, even globalization itself is actually fueled by capitalism. And when it's fueled by capitalism, it's also not exempted from the problems of capitalism. Marx also made mention that, we are now living in a time when there's a lot of surpluses. What do you mean by surplus? What is in excess in production? Okay, when we produce something, it's always excessive. I'll give you an instance. The kind of food production that we have right now, it can actually feed everyone who is hungry every single day. With the kind of surpluses that we have right now, with the kind of production that we have right now, no one is supposed to be hungry. Everyone living in this planet is supposed to get a share of production because there's a lot of it, a lot of surplus. But the problem is it's not happening, right? Because surplus turns into profit. Everyone should be having a fair share in the surplus. But it's not happening. Why? Because the capitalists are actually controlling these surpluses and they transform it into profit. That's why Marx believed that profit is actually something evil because it's a work of fiction. It does not really exist to the mind of Marx. Okay? And so, socialism would allow everyone to live off this social surplus. But this could only come out through the agency of the working classes. Meaning to say, Marx believed that in order for this to happen, the working class had to step up. There's no one, only them. So for Marx, they are the cornerstone of what he called emancipation from the system. And now, can it happen? Well, unfortunately, there's no other recourse but a bloody revolution. Okay? Because of this bloody revolution, the working class will be able to balance the system. Okay? But of course, if you're a student in history, you'll realize that, it didn't really happen as what was intended by Marx or how Marx foresaw the future of capitalism. Right? As a matter of fact, those who took Marx very seriously were basically the ones who suffered a lot. I mean, if you look at Maoist China, if you look at the Great Leap Forward, all these things, the Cultural Revolution, a lot of people died for the sake of, this kind of utopian society. Millions have died here in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. I mean, in Indonesia, 800,000 communists died. In Cambodia, with the Khmer Rouge, the communists actually staged the murdering, the genocide of their own people. Can you imagine that? Okay, so, I mean, if you study the Bolshevik Revolution, if you look at Stalin, a lot have died actually. There was a moment in our history when more than 1 billion are actually living in communist states. But it suddenly collapsed. That led to, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama to even declare that, it's the end of history. Democracy already won. Right? And so, in keeping with the argument that capitalism progressively expands beyond nation states. So look at that. Marx will say capitalism is beyond nation state. Time will come, it will expand. Okay? It will even become imperial, as the other Marxists will say. And it will create a world market. Marx and Engels argued that nationalism will gradually diminish in the face of a unifying logic of a global capitalist economy. Well, we're seeing it now. Now, I want to end our discussions on Marx with Antonio Gramsci. I think Antonio Gramsci is the best Marxist ever. Well, that's just my opinion. Antonio Gramsci is an Italian philosopher, thinker, who's also Marxist. Um, you see, Marx believed that with these, with capitalism, okay, as we have said, revolution is inevitable because within capitalism, it's so flawed that it carried the seed of its own destruction. The kind of exploitative nature of capitalism is basically the seed of its own destruction. But the thing is, if you look at history, most of or all the you know the all the leading capitalist societies or states did not have a communist revolution. I mean, look at the United States. There's no communist revolution in the US. Look at England. There's no communist revolution in England. So why is that? Was Marx wrong? Antonio Gramsci came or reached this idea which he called hegemony. Remember that what Marx said was the economic basically influenced the superstructure. The superstructure is the social, the political, the cultural, and everything within the society. Antonio Gramsci added the idea of hegemony. The capitalist or the system is not just simply controlling surpluses, it's not just simply controlling the forces of production, but it also controls value systems. It controls ideas. Capitalism reached a point where the values and virtues of capitalism were actually seen as a kind of common sense. Right? It was seen as a kind of common sense. And so, societies all over the world basically stopped questioning capitalism. I mean, look at us Filipinos. I mean, we've been hearing from our parents, from our grandparents, from the older generation that you need to study, right? And the motivation behind studying is basically what? To become rich, right? To become happy, to do what you want in your life, to buy this house, to buy that house, to have, fashionable clothes, to buy all these gadgets, basically to live a pleasurable life, right? Well, at the outset, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. I mean, Adam Smith tells us that there's really nothing wrong with self-interest. But the thing is, we stopped questioning it. Why? Because we have accepted it to be a common sense, to be something that is already self-evident. And so that's what Antonio Gramsci is talking about. No revolution happened. Why? Because of the hegemony of capitalism, meaning to say, because capitalism has basically dominated the realm of ideas. How people see things, how people imagine things, how people see themselves and the people around in the society, basically were all fashioned by the values and virtues of capitalism. The value of individualism, self-interest, consumerism, and all these things basically become a kind of common sense. Now, I'm not saying that these things are bad. No, as a matter of fact, we need them. Even Marx himself knew that with these things, the society could actually accumulate wealth. But I think what's wrong is that we stopped questioning these things. We just simply accepted that everything that is happening is actually a part of the game. Right? And so, that's why in the beginning of this discussion, I told you that I don't really agree that capitalism, or that communism is an alternative to capitalism. It's not. It could not be an alternative to capitalism. Otherwise, there's gonna be a lot of people who will die. And what? When communist regimes are established, it's still the same. Right? It's still the same. There's no, come on, political equality. I don't think so. But the thing is, the ideas of Marx still, even up to this point, provide us with an idea to critique the downside or the shadow of capitalism.